Hello, dear listeners. Today's episode is on Helen DeWitt's novel, The Last Samurai. Published in the year 2000, The Last Samurai is a funny, brainy, and emotionally serious novel that argues there's nothing stopping the average person from reading the Odyssey in the original Greek. Not because they will receive any economic benefit from doing so, but because Greek is a marvelous language. The plot of The Last Samurai consists of a single mother named Sibylla attempting to raise her son Ludo, who may or may not be a genius. In order to provide for them both, Sibylla transcribes old magazines into a computer database and keeps her son distracted by teaching him languages. The second half of the novel features a sort of quest in which the son, Ludo, attempts to find a father that suits him, and along the way we get reflections on education and what constitutes good art. John and I get into a lot of great topics on this one, from the benefits of teaching yourself a language to the greatness of Akira Kurosawa and books where characters talk about books. We go a little long on this one, but I think it's worth it. This book is excellent, and I'm really glad we got to read it for the podcast. And honestly, I think I'm going to get into learning a language. We hope you enjoy the conversation. That also reminds me, I saw this Truth Social post this morning, and I've been reflecting on it. Not that we have to get into politics because it might sidetrack us, but this particular phrasing, where is it? Hold on. Because I'm subscribed to his Truth Social post, but recently they've just been very depressing because it's you can't riff anymore, and everything is
everything's too scary to riff.
It's true. Wow, where is it?
The president said the riffs will stop.
Yeah, the tariffs are happening. Hold on, I can't find it now. But he ends up saying something where he's like, "It will be very painful, but it might not be." It's just I hate this. I hate this so much.
No, because JD Vance, JD Vance is a big Tolkien guy because he's a Peter Steele protege. So he taught Trump about catastrophe.
I mean, okay, listen to this. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is in all caps. This will be the golden age of America. Will there be some pain? Yes, maybe. And maybe not. But we will make America great again, and it will be worth the price that must be paid. Yeah, honestly, you catastrophe. I think you're right. Vance is telling him about it, and he's like, "You mean that the tariffs will be good eventually?" And he's like, "Yes."
Things will just magically get better.
Yeah.
Then look on the bright side. At least we're too poor to lose very much when the economy crashes and burns.
I honestly did think that. I was like, can't lose anything if you don't have shit.
Exactly. Oh no, my stocks and bonds. Oh God, I get fired from a job where I make $41,000 a year. Where will I find another job that pays that much?
Oh, my crypto, my apes. Yeah,
my apes, my slurp juice.
Yeah, I was like, it's I don't have any property. I don't have any stocks. It'll probably just be fine.
As I was saying, so I feel like kind of the core thing with this book is sort of this idea of what is the human mind capable of? We start off with kind of this this is like a kind of a Bildungsroman. It's kind of like, we have the young boy being educated, and then he goes off on his quest, so to speak. But there's all these references to J.S. Mill and the fact that he, started reading Greek when he was 3, and Sibella's, kind of ambivalence about whether or not Ludo is actually a genius or if he's just someone who's been given like a really good head start.
Or as she says multiple times, somebody who can do simple repetitive tasks well. Because that's all that learning a language is. Yeah. It's just doing simple repetitive tasks well. So,
but I think, this book is asking, like, is there such a thing as genius? Is this just a matter of like what opportunities people are given? How does education function in our society? I find myself thinking kind of back to the scenes where he first goes to school, and because he's been like overeducated at 6, like he can't function in like a normal classroom because he's like too curious, asking too many questions. He's like being disruptive, which, as someone who like had very severe ADHD as a child, kind of resonated.
What did you think also in that scene, especially when the teacher says, the classmate next to him finally could say the alphabet? And I think that his accomplishment is much better than whether or not Ludo can add 99 to itself 1,000 times or whatever else he's doing. And I like, what did you think about that part? Because I think Helen DeWitt is very unsparing about generalized education from a like knowledge standpoint, but I think from like the socialized standpoint, she's more ambivalent.
I generally like agree with that. I don't think Helen DeWitt is like staking a claim here that like, oh, everyone should just homeschool their kids and like make them read like Old Norse when they're 5. But I think that there is kind of this thing where, I mean, it is true that if you're someone who, if you have a child or you are a child who's precocious, we'll say you tend to not be well served in a lot of like, standardized education systems for a lot of different reasons. I mean, it's not just kind of, oh, the mean old teacher like doesn't appreciate the fact that you want to read about Japanese history versus, doing times tables. But again, he comes in, he's not prepared for this. And so he has a terrible time. Yeah. So it's kind of this multi-level failure. But I think there's also something here in terms of like, what do we expect from children? What is the point of education in our society? I think that, what I found myself thinking about was the ways in which we really waste the fact that children are incredibly good at learning certain types of knowledge.
Yeah.
On instead teaching basically like obedience. And the fact that, education for most people in our society, and at this point, probably like for really all people in our society, even the rich, isn't really about teaching you ideas or cultivating you in any particular like spiritual or moral way. It's really just about teaching you to be like a good like worker. Because now even like our rich like have to cosplay as like working all the time.
And they were probably, went to some special school where you couldn't look at your phone. So
you have to do more work.
Because I think that's kind of like the Michel Foucault read on school is the idea that, it's all about discipline. It's about power. It's about making bodies behave in certain ways. So like you shouldn't draw on your classmates' papers. You shouldn't walk around the classroom, although places are more open to that now. But you have to sit in class. You have to behave a certain way. You have to be a good worker. And I think too, like there's a lot of stuff in this book where Sibylla has to work her horrible job, and she would much rather be reading about Old Norse or aerodynamics or other things, but instead she has to type on the computer Carp World and transfer issues of Carp World to a digital thing for like 30 to 40 hours a day. So I think there's kind of like I think the book is kind of drawing a parallel there between like wage slavery jobs and going to school and having to do boring stuff because that's the behavior that's expected of you.
I will say in 2025, I know she wasn't getting paid very much, but Sibylla, you're complaining a lot about having like a basically unsupervised, fully remote job.
Yeah, and it's like she does she can kind of do whatever, but the way it's presented is she's like chained to the desk. She has to type transcribe boring magazines, and she doesn't have time to learn, Tamil, for instance. There's no time to learn Tamil, John, when you have to be transcribing 60 hours of carp world, at your email job. So
well, again, it just struck me as like almost a little Office Spacey, where it's just like, oh man, these Gen X guys didn't know how good they had it.
Well, that, if anything, and maybe this is more of the first part, but it reminded me a lot of just being a grad student and realizing that you're not actually interested in the research you're doing. And so you're like sitting there and you're like reading about some guy who's dead, and you're like look out the window and you like see something happening outside and you're like, maybe I'll go look at some sweaters or something. Like, and so like that sort of like procrastination thing really stuck with me. Yeah. Even if, like as you were saying, I do agree that her job in the scheme of things can't be that bad if she can, set her own hours and work from home, basically.
No, yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure that kind of work was like soul draining in the way all labor is, but I don't know. It's just like you don't have to go into an office. You get to like stay at home all day with your kid. There are a lot of people who would do a lot to have that much flexibility.
Well, and we should also mention one of the things I really love about this book is it's really typographically inventive. And in the beginning, like, the kids' voices will interrupt paragraphs of Sibylla's internal thoughts with like all caps. So she'll be like trying to do something and it'll just say all caps, like, what's going on? Like, oh, I did this task. And so like she almost starts teaching her kid how to read Greek because she needs the kid to be distracted so that she can work. And so it starts almost as like a practical thing and then becomes like, this sort of unexpected consequence in that he's actually really good at it. So,
yeah, I found myself thinking, through over this book, I found myself thinking about a phrase I've heard in kind of my psychoanalytic reading over the last year or so, which is this idea of like the child becomes the symptom of the parents. The ways in which kind of the unexpressed like anxieties or psychological traumas of the parents like kind of end up manifesting in the child in like unexpected ways. And I think that that's very relevant in this case where you have Sibylla who's raising this child by herself. And so kind of her interests become his interests and kind of he ends up getting into these things that she's really interested in, but she kind of feels like she can't fully be interested in because she has to, work and things like that. And so he becomes this kind of ravenous machine for like learning all these things she wishes she could be like fully dedicating herself to.
Yeah. And like Japanese is one of them where she's like, I don't feel equipped to teach you Japanese. And he's like, I'll just do it. Also, I will say that from one hand, you could view that as kind of a shortcoming of the book and that like, so it starts off in Sibylla's voice and then it shifts to Ludo's voice, her son, that they're a little too similar at times. But I like you said, John, I think there's an argument to be made that she kind of like, did like a transfer, like a psychological transfer onto her kid in some ways. Like they get a little too close. And I think on one hand that could be viewed as a shortcoming, but I don't mind it because I find the voice to be funny enough and to be engaging on like a just literary level to me at least.
See, I mean, I agree with you from the standpoint that the two voices end up feeling very similar, but I think that it's totally on purpose.
Yeah.
I think that it gets pretty clear at a certain point. There's a time skip at one point. We start when Ludo's 6, and then kind of the second part of the book, I'd say it's roughly the last 2/3 of it, takes place when he's 11. And he is like not gone, like basically like after the disaster of this first attempt to take him to school, like he has basically been self-teaching with intermittent help from his mother. So he has like
and he goes to judo class too.
He goes to judo class. Yeah. But this is like a kid who does not have like normal social interaction with like peers or even like adults who aren't his own mom. And so I think that given the fact that she's also pretty precocious, I think that it makes sense that like, oh, this is a weird kid who's like been stunted by having no like normal social contact for 11 years. Yeah. And so the only voice he kind of has is really the only voice that's been steadily present in his life. And I think that's why he's so desperate to find a father because he feels like he's missing this other half that would like make him a more complete person.
Yeah, there's that part where he's like fantasizing about the dad like telling Sibylla like, well, he doesn't have to do that, or like
Yeah.
the dad would say like, oh, you could do this, and it's like, yeah, it would be nice to have that other guy around as opposed to
He
just
says
being
the best thing about having two parents is that one protects you from the other.
right. Which I mean, I think that's true to an extent.
I mean, I'm not a child psychologist, but I mean, I definitely see how a child could feel that way.
Well, so, and we should mention that Sibylla had Ludo because she slept with a travel writer whose name is given as Liberace for aesthetic reasons, and that she decides not to tell Liberace about this also maybe for aesthetic reasons, and the idea that it's like Liberace is not the father of the child that she wanted. And I find that the interactions with Liberace, as well as the idea that, because I think almost she tells the narrator about this idea, and the idea, or not the narrator, the reader, or just like she's thinking about this idea, and the idea is almost so good that she just decides to like sleep with this guy, as well as the fact that like she wants him to stop talking because like she ends up in his house, and so like she ends up sleeping with him almost as like a polite thing / she's thinking about this other idea, which I think is really important to the book, and we can talk about it in a second. But yeah, then she has the kid, she doesn't contact the kid, or she doesn't contact the kid's father, and then when Ludo decides to contact the father, he's just as disappointed in him as she is. And she's like, actually, I don't want this guy as a father because he's a bad writer. So
Okay, so I definitely want to get into what you just said, but I feel like we're almost getting a little over our skis right now.
yeah,
So I'm gonna pull us back just a smidge to say, welcome to the Infinite Library, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John, one of your hosts.
My name is Ben.
And we're here this week discussing Helen DeWitt's The Last Samurai.
Published in 2000, we should add. Yeah.
And then republished in 2016 by New Directions Press.
And I think, perhaps I can lay out a thesis statement here, John, and you can say how you feel about it. But Last Samurai is a book about how you should learn to read the Odyssey in the original Greek because it's easy and because it's good in the original Greek, and there's no other reason why you shouldn't do it.
Yeah, I generally agree with that, Ben. I think that obviously really like this book. This is like a book that comes up a lot when you talk about like what are like the classics of the last quarter century. This is a book that I think is going to show up like on a lot of critical lists for very good reasons. But I think that this book got me thinking a lot about, education, learning, the humanities, like what are the values of these things? And I think that, I think you and I are both kind of resistant to this idea of like didactic literature, like that literature is like, oh, Helen DeWitt was like writing this to send us a message. But I do think there is something here in terms of like the themes, the way it explains itself, where it is, I think, making a good case for, like you said, the value of like at some level like autodidacticism, but maybe just learning more broadly.
Yeah.
And really making this case that, these things that we think of as these acts of genius really are in your reach in this way that I think most people are never told. And I found that really cool, especially, this book got me thinking a lot about, kind of where we are with the humanities and with all this like kind of AI shit that I know we've talked about on the show before, and kind of this thing where feels like we kind of live in a time where everyone's expectations for themselves intellectually are like at the bottom of a well. Most people feel like even if they wanted to like do something interesting or smart, it's so far beyond them for whatever reason, or, there are all these kind of easier routes to take. Again, you can just type something into ChatGPT and you can get something that kind of sort of looks like what you think about. I think this book is kind of making a case for sort of the existential value of learning.
Yeah, speaking of that, I was trying to find a magical realist story that I'd read a while about like dating a sentient thing of water. And when I put that into Google, Google just wrote me a magical realist story about that. And it was one, the worst thing I've ever read, and two, just completely disappointing. And just, yeah, it's like, why would I give you the story you're looking for when I could just write you a bad version of it? So, yeah, I agree. Easier paths. And this book is like, not in such a way as to shame you, but to suggest that it really is within your reach. You don't have to sell yourself short, even if she blames other institutions for that, such as at times general education. Like the idea is that you could teach yourself how to do this.
Well, it's something I found myself kind of thinking about as I finished up this book. I know you and I are both more on the materialist end of the political spectrum, but sometimes I almost do think that you can be a little, not you personally, but I'll say broadly, like the left. You'd almost get like a little too materialist, and you can kind of forget the value that like the mind can have, and like the power that the mind can have to maybe not let you like totally transcend your material circumstances. Like obviously, your thoughts cannot feed you, and it doesn't like make food and appear in front of you. It can't like warm your house for you. But, the mind has tremendous power to help us cope with the circumstances we find ourselves in. And I think that that's a big part of what this book is talking about as well. And I think that, not to get too into it, but I think that that's a very valuable thing for people to know about and to be thinking about at these we'll say uncertain times we find ourselves in.
Yeah, the groundhog saw that there's going to be tariffs for the next future. He woke up and he saw the tariffs in his shadow. So yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind. So I think just as a general plot outline, unless we wanted to circle around Helen DeWitt a little bit more, The Last Samurai is sort of like a tale of two halves, we might say. The first half is told from Sibylla, the first narrator's perspective, and the second half is told from her son, Ludo. And as you were kind of saying in the opening there, John, her son might be a genius, might not, but the son basically undergoes a quest to find his father. Even though he knows who his real father is, he's trying to find a replacement father.
He's trying to find a father. He's trying to find the father that suits him best.
Yeah. And along the way, we get a lot of stuff about education and about languages, because this book is very concerned with the idea that, as we've been saying, you can teach yourself to learn really anything language related, and you shouldn't just assume you can't because it's hard.
Yeah. So I want to start off, and I apologize, Ben, because I know we are kind of getting a little far afield of where we started when I said I wanted to pull us back a little bit, but I think we can get back to that place here soon. But I did want to talk a little bit about language in this book, because I do think that it is really interesting the way that DeWitt kind of uses language as a foundation for the ideas I think she's working with over the course of this story.
Yeah.
The implication you get is that Ludo is talented at a lot of things, but language is sort of the register we're given to kind of understand his genius kind of the most directly.
Yeah.
Inspired by John Stuart Mill, like I said, Sibylla starts teaching him ancient Greek when he's 4 years old. Sibylla herself I'm a little unclear on kind of like what if she has like a degree in this stuff, but she spent a lot of time when she was at Oxford in her youth studying classical languages. So there's definitely an implication that she has just kind of a knack for these things as well. But Ludo, over the course of the story, we kind of see him picking up Japanese as well. He speaks like, I think at some point they like list out, he speaks like 8 different languages by the time he's 11 years old, and not easy languages either. And I think that it's interesting the way that there's a lot of like text that shows up in this book that sometimes is translated, sometimes isn't. And it kind of serves as this shorthand for erudition. And I think some of that is probably the fact that DeWitt is a writer. And so, it's a lot easier to kind of be impressed by language than by, there's some stuff with like math in this book too. And there's some, he talks about, like practicing tying knots. So it's not like the languages are his only thing, but it definitely feels like the linguistic portions are the things that DeWitt is most comfortable with.
And the baseline, I'd say too, like you said. Yeah.
Yeah. But I also think that there's this thing where I do feel like there's also an element here where it's really key to that message we're talking about, where I feel like for a lot of people, particularly like people in the Anglosphere, speaking a lot of languages is like kind of weirdly still the benchmark for being like really smart. Like that's the thing where like if you tell people like that you're bi or like trilingual, like they're more impressed with that than if you can, like code C++ or something like that.
Or like, or do math really well, because he does get into math at one point.
Or even if you have like a PhD.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who are a lot more impressed if you can speak French, German, and Japanese than if you have a PhD in art history or mathematics.
Well, and as we've been saying, a friend of the pod, Max Lawton, you can also get a lot of good jobs if you can read in different languages. And I think too, when she teaches Ludo Greek, she emphasizes, like I've already kind of mentioned, that it's just about doing a lot of repetitive tasks that are easily accomplished a lot, which is one way of like breaking it down. And I think also when sometimes we're even given like textual translations in the book, because the one thing I love about this book, it is very typographically inventive, and I like that the book will even say like, okay, here's some of the Iliad, here's the actual syllables of the Greek, here's the English translation, here's the notes you should know about it. And so it's almost going like, oh, by the way, you could also do this, let's do it right now, like as you're reading it. And I enjoy that aspect of it, because I think there's a version of this book that doesn't give you the tools to do what it's saying. And I think this book goes at kind of pains to do that.
Well, there's an element where I almost feel like this book is one of the better examples of like the precocious child character.
Oh, I'm glad we're talking about this, because we've dunked on the precocious child character before. And I think this book definitely slots into that. But as I agree, I think it is better.
Well, I think that there's kind of this thing where it's almost a deconstruction of that trope. And that Helen DeWitt's kind of saying, well, if you really wanted to have like a precocious child, this is how they would have had to have been raised.
Yeah.
For them to not have any interest in like, Saturday morning cartoons or, whatever, goofy shit.
Well, there's a great part where like Sibylla says like, you wouldn't be able to read this Tamil syllabary. You'd have to just be playing sports. Like, and there's like a disdain for sports that I find to be really funny. But yeah, like there wouldn't be any time to do other stuff. So
yeah, like if it obviously like there is like a certain level of absurdity in like Ludo doing this at all, but the fact is like, yeah, if you're going to learn that many languages, like that's a lot of just your day just taken up right there.
Yeah.
But it's also this thing where like she's kind of showing her work in a way that like, say, Michael Chabon and the Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay did not, in terms of showing us like how smart this kid is and like why he's so smart and why we should be impressed with him or find him interesting in some way. And I think that works. And I think that grounding us, this book, for kind of having a lot, working in this very like intellective space, is very grounded. One of the big keys to, again, kind of why this family is the way it is that Sibylla is totally broke. She makes like £1.50 an hour in like 1990s money, which I'm not going to do the conversions, but I'm guessing that's not very much. Or no, it's $5.50 an hour, which is still not very much. Their house, their apartment, like she can't afford to heat it through most of the winter, so they just end up like riding the subway around and around for hours and hours while she kind of tutors him on these readings.
I wanted to say, speaking of that, one, she links that to very specifically a memory of like reading Aristotle on the bus. and like looking up and going like, or on the subway and going like, the life of the mind is wonderful. and while at one point that's like cliche, I've definitely had that experience when you're like on public transit and you're reading and you're just not worried about where you're going. You don't have to think about where you're driving. Someone else is driving you and you can just read a book and just be totally gone from the planet for like a period of time. And I like that she kind of reaches for that also out of necessity, as you said, because she can't heat her home. But then at some point, like the idea of doing that just becomes detestable to Ludo. He's like, I'm tired of riding the subway. I don't want to keep reading books on the subway. This sucks. And like he does that when he gets old enough, but like there's like a sort of emotional pretext for that, one that I've experienced at least. And then like they have to rely on it out of necessity, as you've said, and then it eventually becomes to be like a chore for Ludo to do it.
But it's this idea of like things are grounded. Like we're not operating in like a hyper real exactly like environment.
Yes. Yeah.
There is this element where like despite like some absurdities here and there in terms of like the magazines she's uploading, like you said, like Carp World, this book is pretty grounded in terms of like what it's portraying. And I think that really goes a long way towards getting us to buy into these characters who I think you could do like a very twee version of this story that would feel a lot worse. When we get kind of into that second half and Ludo is again, like kind of trying to interview these men to like find his father, I found myself thinking about like a different version of this book where it's treated like with a lot more flippancy. But each one of these like interviews he does, like they're always like kind of heart-wrenching because you can see like this is not like Wes Anderson, or not Wes Anderson. That's not. I think his characters actually tend to be much better sketch, but this isn't like a twee character who is kind of doing this in a silly way. Like these encounters always have this element of like pathos to them
and danger too.
And danger, yeah. We'll get to that when we talk about. I think we'll probably end up going through each of the interviews because I think that there's some of the most interesting stuff in the book. But you can see the like, oh, this is like a kid who's like actually like really going through it. Like this is not some kind of like. I think like the criticism you can make of a lot of like precocious child characters is like this is just an adult mind in a child's body that an adult is writing because they don't remember what it was like to be a child. And Ludo never felt like that to me. Ludo felt like a child who has been given some very strange and in some ways enviable opportunities to learn, but he is still fundamentally an 11-year-old who has no idea about how the world works.
And like those opportunities have also had some side effects, we might say.
Yes. That is definitely something I found myself thinking about as I was reading this too. I was like, part of me was like, oh man, I kind of wish that like my parents had like made me read ancient Greek when I was a kid instead of like watching TV. But then I'm like, yeah, but then I never would have watched TV.
Well, and then if you met somebody, like you would only be able to talk about that. So like,
there's a reason he has to go out and like try to find a new father, and it's because he can't relate to like his real father, who's just like a boring travel writer and not someone who he can like, feel any sense of connection to because he has just had this incredible set of circumstances shaping his mind.
Well, and I also just wanted to briefly circle back, and you'd mentioned twee. So Helen DeWitt is also on Twitter, and while I don't know if she uses it as much, she generally does post interesting things. And when there was that controversy on Twitter about the Odyssey translations, which I don't know if we have time to wade into, she did put her own 2 cents in, and she had said something that I think is interesting, which is she got into a program to study the classics, and she described it as twee, and she said specifically Donna Secret History. Donna Tartt, yeah. She said it was Donna Hart Secret History, but twee and bad. And then she's like, you know what? I don't want to do this. I want to do seriously the classics. And so then she got into Oxford, much like the character in Last Samurai. And so she describes how like the reading list was really tough and she felt really underprepared. But she said in many ways it was life changing. And so I think that's kind of like the impetus for sort of where Sibylla comes from and like where Helen DeWitt thinks languages should go. She also mentions, just as an aside, one of the reasons she even wanted to do this was because she read these like modernist poetic translations of the Odyssey, and she said that they were horrible. So, no, it wasn't the Odyssey. I think it was Greek plays. I have the quote here because I thought it's worth bringing up in terms of like why she did it. Oh yeah. I loathe these texts. It was the Aristria and Sophocles Oedipus plays in English. The idea behind the series was virtuous. Instead of commissioning translations of Greek tragedy from classicists, each text was the result of a collaboration between a classicist and a poet. But as I say, I loathe these texts, which seem to me, I would now say, to equate a flavor of modernism with the poetic. I thought if Sophocles had written something like this, the plays would never have survived for over 2,000 years. The original has to be better than this. So I like the idea, as you were saying, John, like there's like a twee affected version, and then there's a version that's closer to the truth. And I think, you know, DeWitt's aesthetic sensibilities lie more in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself thinking a little bit about my own education as I was reading this, and I think that, you know, it's a complicated topic, and it's something. I'm not a teacher. I'm not involved in education, you know, on the institutional level in any way. But it does seem like there is something that has happened with education where standards have declined a lot over the last, you know, however many, I don't even know how many decades. And, you know, I think that there's something in this book where it does raise kind of the specter a few times of kind of when people are reacting to Ludo's knowledge. You know, there are people who say like, oh, you know, classic languages like that, learning those has been like an obstacle, like to basically like class mobility in this country because rich people all learn to speak the stuff and working class people don't. And I like, there's part of me that definitely agrees with that critique, but it seems like because of a lot of other institutional and like material factors, the thing has been, well, now we just don't teach anyone Latin and Greek. And we just kind of have everyone working at this same like lower baseline because we don't want to put the work in of like bringing everyone up higher.
Well, and sort of on my end, just speaking from the PhD, like you used to have to learn 2 languages to get an English PhD. They were probably like Latin and Greek. And then at some point it became you can learn 2 languages of whatever you want. And then it became actually you could learn 1 language and then get a research skill and you don't have to learn 2 languages. And so I think just even the course of like getting a PhD in English on my end, you can see it get a little more and more like, well, let's do something you'd actually use versus, well, we don't even really have to do that. You could just do like a research skill. And, you know, now I took a test I can read in Spanish, but I don't use it for my research. So, yeah.
Yeah. You know, I think that it's this thing where, I mean, it's this crisis of like reproduction on the academy level where I think you can ask less and less of people when there's fewer and fewer jobs for them to realistically have when they're going to get out of the program, I think is probably part of it.
Yeah.
But it's also this thing where, I don't know, I think a lot about this way where, again, you know, why is Ludo able to do this? It's because he's not distracted all the time by television and, you know, I mean, there's an internet at this point, but that's not really like a thing he's dealing with. So I'll just, you know, television or, you know, the radio.
Would Ludo have a smartphone? The answer is no.
But it's sort of this thing where I think I've been thinking about kind of, I think part of what this book is kind of saying is that there's sort of this level where there's so many distractions in the world. I mean, there've always been, but I think really kind of one of the defining features of the period of modernity we're in is the just glut of distractions we're surrounded with at all times.
Yeah.
You know, largely because of phones, but, you know, at some level, you know, this has been a thing I don't even know for how long, but I mean, you know, TV, constant access to music through radio or streaming services. There's so many ways you can spend your time that a lot of this more rigorous work even if, again, you're in like an educational institution, it becomes harder and harder to not just like justify to yourself, but also for like an institution to be able to reliably like get people to do.
Yeah.
I didn't go to Oxford, but I went to like a top tier American like research university. And I went kind of expecting to have that Helen DeWitt going to Oxford experience. And then I got there and I found that most of my peers, and this is not really like, I'm not putting them down when I say this, but they wanted to, be on social media all day and like listen to Spotify all, with all their free time and, the way that kind of everybody does.
Yeah.
And that was like disillusioning in a way, but at the same time, I didn't do that much differently at the time. But it's kind of this thing where, again, it's like, how do you get people to focus when there's not enough, there's no rewards necessarily for pushing yourself harder, which I think with the humanities is very unfortunately relevant.
Well, and too, like, as you'd mentioned, when they're on the bus, people come up to them and find out Ludo's reading Greek. And she says, many people say that's really good for verbs. Many people say you shouldn't be torturing the kid like this. Many people say, oh, that'll pay off later. Nobody says, oh, that's good because reading the Odyssey in the original Greek is a good thing. Like,
it's marvelous.
Marvelous on its own.
Because Greek is a marvelous language.
Right. And so, as you were saying, John, like sometimes with the humanities, it's like technically the best advertisement would be it's its own reward. But, that's really hard to square in distractive capitalism, game space, hell world that we live in right now. Like, it's hard to say that.
Especially when, it costs so much to study these things a lot of times, which I think is, obviously things have progressed a lot in an even worse direction since Helen DeWitt was writing this. But I mean, school was still expensive in the 1990s and early 2000s. It's hard to ask people to spend that much money, which I think is a big part of why this book is kind of a pain to self-teaching.
Yeah.
And to, I guess you would say, like, alternative education in a way. I do think it's pretty crucial that Ludo kind of never ends up in school.
Yeah, you think there's going to be the like, oh, let's get him with the rest of the people, but he doesn't. He doesn't end up like that.
This is a book where I feel like it's dealing with a lot of stuff that you and I are very interested in on a personal level.
Yeah.
But I feel like we should try to hone back in on the text for the sake of this podcast, not just being us talking about our personal opinions. Why don't we circle back to kind of the conception of Ludo and kind of this scene, because this is the inciting incident for the book, really.
Yeah.
And I think that there are a lot of really key ideas here to, what the book's about. And I interrupted you.
So, as we were saying, Ludo was kind of conceived in a one-night stand scenario with a travelite writer whose name is Liberace. And as I was sort of getting to John, she has this idea about languages that is almost like, well, one, the fact that she sleeps with Liberace because she wants him to be quiet, and two, because she's almost so excited about this idea that it sort of carries her away. And I wanted to read, I'm not going to get into I like that she includes a quote from Schoenberg, the composer's ideas about using all the notes of the scale, which I won't get into, but Schoenberg's like, why don't we create music that's not accepted? Why are we not using all of these pitches? And so she says on page 62, before reading this brilliant book, I had thought that books should be more like the film The Godfather, in which at one stage Al Pacino goes to Sicily and the Italian is all in Italian. Now I thought that this was a rather simple-minded way of looking at the question. If you say that in a book the Italians should speak Italian because in the actual world they speak Italian, and the Chinese should speak Chinese because Chinese speak Chinese, it is a rather naive way of thinking of a work of art. It's as if you thought this was the way to make a painting. The sky is blue. I will paint the sky blue. The sun is yellow. I will paint the sun yellow. A tree is green. I will paint the tree green. And what color is the trunk? Brown. This was all rather commonplace, and yet the languages of the world seemed like little heaps of blue and red and yellow powder, which had never been used. But if a book just used them so that the English spoke English and the Italian spoke Italian, that would be as stupid as saying use yellow for the sun because the sun is yellow. So in other words, like, you should use all the colors of the rainbow. Why shouldn't a book use them? Why shouldn't you speak all of those languages, or at least learn about them? At which point she then goes to a party and the travel writer starts hitting on her, and they go home and they sleep together, mostly because Helen DeWitt wants him to stop talking. And there's also a bit that I'm going to say for a minute about aesthetic principles, wherein she likes things that are not the things the travel writer likes. And as a result, she decides to leave and never tell Ludo about their father until Ludo finds him. But the reason is aesthetic principles.
Yeah, Ben, I noticed you had a mild Freudian slip there where you said Helen DeWitt wanted the travel writer Liberace to stop talking, not Sibella.
Yeah.
Which I do think is I'm associating here. I'm thinking about one thing I do really like in this book, and for what I know, like, this is something DeWitt does in a lot of her work. I think this book is very deft with, like, gender relations.
Yes. Yeah.
And yeah, like the Sibella dealing with this guy who is, like, trying to get in her pants, and, you know, she's not unattracted to him exactly, but she's also not really all that into him, but she's just like, you know what, this will make him shut the fuck up. And I feel like that carries through a lot of kind of the encounters with men in this book in particular, where they tend to be almost uniformly horrible, particularly to women.
Yeah, they're like, horrible to women. They're like, they don't pick up on any cues. Like, none of the men are good at picking up cues in this book. So
yeah, they're all more just in like when Ludo's, like, interviewing these men later in the book, like, almost all of them just get so caught up in talking about themselves or their ideas that they quit listening to him. Yeah, which creates some comic scenarios. But crucially, also, one of the things I noticed is that almost all the men, when Ludo tells them that he's their son, they don't say, "Well, I've only ever slept with my wife." Almost all of them are like, "Oh God, she told me she took care of that."
Or like, "Oh, I must have been so drunk that I don't remember." Yeah.
So it's just kind of this thing where I know, like, one of her other big works is, like, a big takedown of kind of, like, corporate like masculinity, basically. I can't think of the name of the book.
Yeah, so it's called Lightning Rods, and the premise is that sexual harassment happens at work. So what if you could just visit a prostitute at work? And that's basically the premise of the book. I like it, but I like this a lot more because, like, I like the ideas more in Last Samurai, but Lightning Rods is still, like, really well written, and it's, like, very funny.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's good. Like, that, from what I know of that book, I haven't read it personally, but it's clearly, like, more of a comedy than this one is. I mean, this is a very funny book, but it's not working in, like, that's working like a screwball register.
Yes.
Whereas, again, this is working on more of, like, a Wes Anderson register. But I do just think that the way she observes men, and in particular kind of this milieu of, like, very accomplished, well-educated British men, to be very interesting.
Yeah, and the sort of the social standing that comes with that as well.
Yeah. And therefore the social license that comes with that.
Yeah. Well, and so, like, I did want to mention the thing about why she doesn't like this particular masculine writer's style, because I think it's worth talking about just briefly. So when she's at Liberace's house, Liberace starts reading to her from the author Lord Lytton, the writer, who is not Lord Lytton, the painter of somebody she hates. And as she says, "Only the pen of Lord Lytton, the writer, could do justice to the brush of Lord Lytton, the painter. For just so did Lord Lytton, the writer, bring the most agitated emotions to an airless, to a hushed, to an unhurried while each word took on, because there was all the time in the world for each word to take on the blossom which only a great master can give to the word, using his time to allow all unseemly energy to become aware of its nakedness, and snatch gratefully at the fig leaf provided, until all passion in the airlessness, in the hush, in the absence of hurry, sank decently down down in the slow death of motion to perpetual stasis. A character could not look or step or speak without a gorgeous train of sentences swathing his poor stupid thoughts and unfolding in beautiful languor on the still and breathless air. Liberace saw my glance and said, "Are you a fan?" And I said, "No." And he said, "But he's marvelous." He picked up the book and began to read one lovely sentence after another, and I said in despair, "How beautiful," as one might say. "Look at that feather. Look at the velvet. Look at the fur." The idea that it's like beautiful for the sake of being beautiful and sort of like, we might say overtly concerned with artifice is not what Sibylla wants, nor I would say Helen DeWitt wants.
Yeah. I'm thinking now what that got me thinking about was something that I think looms very large over this book, and I think we'd really be remiss if we didn't mention, is the role that Akira Kurosawa's the Seven Samurais, or the Seven Samurai, plays in this book.
Which is, we might say, the good art, if that's the bad.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the title is a reference to that film. And yeah, so I actually had the real pleasure of, kind of by happenstance, not because we were reading this book, but I got to go see The Last Samurai Seven Samurai at my local Alamo Draft House a couple weeks ago on the big screen.
And did you agree that it's one of the masterpieces of modern cinema?
I mean, how could I not?
Yeah.
But yeah, the movie plays like a huge role in the book. There's sections of this book that are just basically stuff ripped directly from the script being quoted as.
Yeah, the screenplay itself.
Various purposes, generally in the original Japanese with the phonetics and then the translation. But like basically, Sibylla loves this movie
obsessively,
and kind of we get the impression that like she makes Ludo watch it like hundreds of times, and that she has watched it hundreds of times. Like I think there's a scene when Ludo's a little older where he comes back and it's clear that she's just been watching the movie by herself.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because there's also this level where she starts doing it because she's like, I need to give my son a masculine role model. And if I make him watch The Seven Samurai, I'm giving him 8 male role models.
Yeah, all the samurai plus the director, Akira Kurosawa.
And, I really liked that. I really like the role that this film plays in this book. I think that one of the really sad things about kind of the current state of the arts, and I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else, is the way that there's so much we feel like we have to consume all the time that I feel like it's really rare to connect with the work on that level. I mean, this is obviously kind of being taken to a somewhat absurd degree, but sometimes I wish I had like one thing that I loved that much and that I revisited it over and over again, because there is work that you can revisit over and over and over again and you can find something new in it. I think in the last couple of years I've read Moby Dick and Don Quixote, and those are both, and Dream of the Red Chamber, and Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and those are books I could absolutely see myself coming back to and finding new things in over and over and over again. But also, we're just inundated all the time with there's new books coming out. There's new releases of old books coming out. There's a book you've just never heard of before that someone tells you about on a podcast, and you feel like you need to get to that. And obviously, Seven Samurai, very long film, 3.5 hours. But still.
Definitely rewards the attention.
Yeah. I just really appreciated the way that this book sort of describes that relationship between like a text and a reader, because Ludo, compared to kind of the ambivalence he develops around some of the stuff his mom wants him to be interested in as he gets older, like reading on the train, he clearly develops a very deep appreciation for this movie, and it kind of like almost becomes like his Bible in a way.
Yeah,
Like,
and it's sort of the language kind of imprints itself in the story and in the plot as well.
yeah, this whole kind of latter section of the book is really inspired, and he more or less tells us this in his own voice. There's a scene in the Seven Samurai, for those who haven't seen the film, where there are two samurai dueling with bamboo poles as like a practice match, more or less. Or not really a practice match, as like it's a duel, but they're not trying to kill each other.
Yeah, they're not using real swords.
Yes, and the match happens. One guy basically he says it's a draw, but the other guy's like, no, if we'd been using real swords, I would have killed you. And the other guy says, well, then let's do it with real swords so I can prove that you're not better than me. And they go again with real swords. And guess what? Guy A gets killed by Guy B because he was not as good.
Well, also, when I saw that the first time, it's one of the examples of the two swordsmen passing, and then it holds on them, and then one of them falls over. And like I had seen that cliche before, but when I saw it for the first time, I'm like, okay, this is awesome. like yeah, it's like you can see why they ripped it off, because like one, he gets the Kurosawa presents the movement so well, but two, he holds for just enough time for then when the guy falls over, it's like, I don't know, it feels like surprising each time, and you're like, okay, I can see why everybody ripped this scene off like after that. So
yeah, not to get too into the film, but man, that movie's so cool with like how much it does, despite the fact that like technology just wasn't really there to do like a lot of blood effects.
Yeah,
but all the violence still plays is like totally like real despite that fact.
Yeah, like real, and then like filmed with like a real sense of like, yeah, drama and like things hitting each other and stuff like that. So
yeah. But basically, like Ludo, when he's talking to these men, he's always thinking of it in terms of like he's dueling them.
Yeah.
And he's got to figure out like, more or less, it's like he starts with kind of this lie of, I'm your biological son. That's the duel with wooden swords. And then, he's trying to, I think, feel out basically like, can this like strange man love me? And, if he thinks they can, then that would be the dueling with real swords. Because, that's when he would be risking real like emotional intimacy with another person.
Yeah.
Whereas when he's lying, he can just pull out and be like, I'm not your son, actually. This was a weird like prank I'm playing, and he can just get out of there. And
as we see, the men react usually very poorly to this. So yeah.
Imagine that.
Yeah. What a surprise. Yeah. Well, okay. So, do we want to get into the fathers now, or is there anything?
That's what I was going to say. I feel like we've done enough setup where we can move into this. So it actually starts in kind of like a bass-ackwards way, where it starts with Ludo contriving to meet his actual real father.
Yeah, the travel writer Liberace.
Yes. And yeah, more or less, he talks to this man and he finds him to just be such a dullard, which I feel really checks out. Like I've been thinking about I was thinking about like travel writing when I was reading this, and it's like kind of a thing that I feel like doesn't really exist. Like it's been totally superseded by like influencer TikTok
video
style advertising, where it's like you don't really. Or just like the fact that the internet exists, you don't need like a guidebook on like what to do in Latvia, because you can just Google things to do in Latvia. You don't need like a special book to tell you what to do.
And we're presented with his writing only through Sibylla pointing out all of the cliches, like a veritable cathedral of ice, like, which is like something that he loves repeating, and like just like sort of weird depictions of like the people from the countries and like horrible, like sort of, like looking down on them sort of depiction. Like it sounds like he's just like, just crammed full of cliches in all of his writing.
Well, it's I know we decry like the loss of like writing as a thing you could make money at, but I guess it's always good to remember that like that economy was totally founded on hacks doing hack work.
Yeah. Just slapping together the pre-printed phrases so you can get the thing done. So,
but yeah, he meets this guy and he's like, this guy won't do. Like, I don't want to be his son. I don't find any, like, there's nothing of value for me to like learn from this man. He's like a complete, like, non-entity of a person. Like, there's no substance here. This isn't what I wanted. This isn't what I felt like I was missing when I was a child. And so he's like, you know what? I'm going to go out and I'm going to find a better father. And so he kind of starts combing through, like, more or less, like he starts as like being on the lookout for like erudite men of status.
yeah.
And then contriving ways into their homes so that he can
duel them, basically. Yeah.
So he can verbally spar with them and determine whether or not he wants to be their son.
And I will confess, John, that when I read this the first time, I was deep in my fuck plot vibes, and I found this part to be like kind of like disappointing in comparison to the almost like one thing after another picaresque like parenting Ludo stuff. But then when I read it this time, I think it came across as a lot tighter and sort of demonstrates, I think, the themes of the first part better. Because I was a little like, great plot. And I'm like, when I was reading it this time, I'm like, okay, I think this is like a natural extension of the first part of this book.
Well, I think we'll get into it kind of as we go, but I like also, it doesn't feel like there's like a totally satisfying like narrative arc that we go on with these men. Like it feels like it's a lot like bumpier in terms of kind of what Ludo's getting out of each encounter. And it doesn't feel like it's kind of this very, like there's definitely like a version of this where you could maybe rearrange these a little bit and get like a more standard like plot curve.
Yeah.
That I feel like DeWitt is resisting here. Yeah, let's just go through episode by episode. Because I think that's like a good way to kind of summate our thoughts here. Okay, so Samurai number 1. We have Hugh Charles, is that his name?
I think it's Hugh Carey.
Hugh Carey, that's right.
Yeah.
So Hugh Carey is a linguist who had like a fairly outrageous adventure where he discovered like this lost tribe somewhere around like Xinjiang.
Like what? So Western China, right? Like sort of. Yeah.
Or like somewhere on the steppe.
Yeah.
And like I feel like the implication is like maybe like the 1950s. And like he comes back to England and like he writes this kind of like rip roaring like adventure novel about, not novel, but like memoir about his experiences. Someone intimated to us that he probably made all of this up. Because basically a bunch of people like read the book and were like, well, there's no way you could possibly have been here at this point in time. Like, so he's clearly there's implication he's something of a charlatan, but
we should say that the language that described like different genders use different moods and tenses, I think, is like the big discovery. Yes. So yeah.
So and Ludo has remarked at certain points like he wants to find like languages that have like very unique and like different ways of like expressing things. Like he talks about how he likes what is it? Is it Arabic? Arabic and Hebrew better because they have gendered plurals, whereas Greek only has like a neutral plural.
Yeah.
Which, okay, kid. So he's very taken with the story, and this man is this kind of like rich cloistered academic type, and he's like, you know what, I'm gonna wing it. I'm really interested in languages. This guy's like a famous linguist. Let's see what happens. So I think it's interesting. He starts with like, this guy's definitely the oldest of them.
Yeah.
When he meets this guy, he's like, well, the last time like I had sex was in 83. This is definitely, I feel like, one of the ones where we kind of see, again, like this certain type of like British guy that I think DeWitt is sending up here, where he's probably a liar, but he's managed to like turn that lie into like a very respectable career in a way.
Well, and importantly, he had a kid with somebody from the tribe. That's how he, quote unquote, figured out how the tribe works. And the kid was then sold into slavery. So at one point, Ludo says, more or less, the price of this knowledge was a slave. And so you can almost see him like kind of rejecting this dad because of the sort of, we could say like, one, not caring about whatever cost went into getting this knowledge, if it's true or not. And the fact that Ludo sort of sees that kid as like a twin of him. And he's like, well, if he treated that kid this way, you know, he would treat me, you know, he's not a good dad.
Well, this guy has like a very negative reaction, like off the bat. Like basically he's like, oh, you're here for money. Like he like tries to like quiz Ludo on a bunch of stuff. And then like when Ludo is able to like answer his questions and like prove that he's intelligent, the guy's like, well, I cannot pay. I'm not paying for you to like go to school. And then Ludo's like, well, I don't go to school. And he's like, what? How are you not going to school? And so Ludo feels like this dejection like very early. And, you know, yeah, he shows his hand. He's like, I've been lying. I'm not actually your son. And the guy punches him in the face.
Well, wait, no, doesn't the second guy punch him? This guy just like,
yep, you're right.
This guy does act very like, oh, wait. And he's like, you know what? I'm out. Like, yeah, like he suddenly becomes like contrite kind of. Yeah. But,
I definitely feel like this is the weakest of them.
I actually, John, what did you think about the story of Hugh Carey's relationship to Raymond Decker? I found this part to be kind of fascinating because basically the quick on this, and we'll move to the next father, is that both of them are at Oxford. Both of them are studying languages, but Raymond Decker is basically Socrates and that he's more interested in true things as opposed to sort of like conventional knowledge or sort of scholastic opinion. And he's always going like, I can't do this. And Hugh Carey is like, it's just like playing chess. All of academic arguments are opening, middle game, end game. And so he like coaches Raymond Decker through this education. But on the time to take the final test, Raymond Decker looks at a guy who spent 20 years writing his life work on one part of Plato's Republic. And he basically goes, I can't pretend to know more than this guy. And so he doesn't do the test. And then he ends up basically going in like a cram school. And so he's like stuck there. And Raymond Decker no longer talks to Hugh Carey. And Hugh Carey's like sort of jilted. And then at that point, he's just like, you know what? I'm going to just find this lost tribe. So it's like this sort of like bromance that like kind of like curdles. And I was wondering what you like thought about that.
I thought it was a lovely short story that I maybe wouldn't have inserted into this novel.
Well, because like there's something interesting about like that split. It's like two ideas rather than an actual relationship, and then they just like crumple basically. But
yeah, well, I mean, I think that I like it from the standpoint again. I think it's DeWitt looking at like institutional education,
yeah,
and kind of this way in which, you know, that seems to be part of the conflict that Ludo like eventually has with this guy. This guy is like, again, an institutional academic, but ultimately like he's not interested in knowledge. He's interested in a career. And so he's willing to lie or sell a child into slavery or, you know, do these questionable things to like secure a comfy career, like teaching about linguistics at a university versus, you know, Ludo's looking for something deeper than that. You know, maybe not necessarily the same kind of level of like spiritual truth that it seems like Raymond Raymond?
Yeah, I think it's Raymond Decker. Yeah.
Raymond Decker is looking for, but he's looking for, you know, he's looking for like a greater purpose for his knowledge. And this guy clearly is not interested in that. This guy is completely interested just like in playing the game of academic politics and making money. He has no interest in like truth or beauty or art or anything. It's just about how do I secure a career for myself? Yeah,
it's surfaces, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I agree. It's just kind of an interesting detour into like this section on him. And then, yeah, at which point Ludo kind of rejects him. He's suddenly kind of contrite at being rejected. And he's like, no, wait, come back. And then Ludo just leaves. And so then we're on to the next father.
Yes, Sorabji. Sorabji's, I feel like this one was interesting. So Sorabji's like a Zoro. He comes. So I'm guessing he's like Persian, British, like from a Zoroastrian background. He's like a TV astronomer. Like he's someone who seems like he does kind of like Carl Sagan-esque, like public science on television.
Also, John, a wonderful title of his program, Mathematics, the Universal Language, which is perfect. But yeah. So,
but yeah, Ludo basically sees him on TV, which is how he, finds out he's interested in this man. He goes over to this guy's house again. One of the things I just couldn't quite get over is, again, the fact that he's just able to talk himself into these people's houses so easily. Yeah, because every time he shows up, they're like, well, he's not seeing anyone. And he's like, oh no, he'll see me. And then like the like poor put upon like housekeeper or something is like, oh man, I don't want to. Okay, come in.
Yeah, Ludo, one, ultimate con man, and two, like the fact that he can just be a precocious child, it seems like enough for him to get into a house, basically. So, like, and that's how like Sibylla says, anytime you want to write somebody a letter, say Ludo, age 5, and people will take you seriously. or like Ludo, age 12, like however old he is that he does this.
But Sorabji is kind of almost the opposite of the first guy, and so he is like a consummate family man. He has like 3 children.
He makes them do math problems.
Yeah. We see his wife, which I don't think we see from any of the other potential fathers. Like he has this very like kind of warm, cozy family life. And when Ludo tells him that he's his son, first he has like an emotional breakdown because he really did like have an affair that ended in like a pregnancy that he is not totally clear on the status of. So, and
he does not want anyone to find out.
He's really very attached to this very wholesome image he has for himself. But also he's one of the fathers who he actually does like seem to want to take some kind of responsibility. He offers like to help Ludo get into a very prestigious like boarding school.
Ludo is, it should be noted, very good at math, at least in this current like math that he's doing, because in order to meet with sit with the parents at the parents' table, you have to do mathematics, and like Ludo does a bunch of problems he knows how to do. Sorabji looks at them and goes, wow, this is very remarkable. Some grad students aren't as good as this, is one of the things that he says to Ludo. And then, that kind of like, suddenly he's like, I got the impression, John, that he was really happy to have a son, because he, I think, only has 3 daughters. Yeah. And I think he's almost like, sort of like really into the idea of having a son who's good at math, who's a lot like him.
He's like a successor.
Yeah.
Because one of the things he says is that like his marriage like is now kind of loving, but it seems like this affair he had was like the real like love of his life. And
interesting
he only, like,
that he describes
his wife originally.
Yeah, he describes his love of his life, not his wife, as being somebody that you could talk to without explaining anything, which I thought was kind of an interesting phrase. Like, she's as smart as him, in quotes. Yeah, something like an equal.
He's kind of tied up very much in like, again, kind of social like presentation. He says he married his wife because his father wanted him to marry a Zoroastrian girl, more or less.
Which I thought was a mirror image of Sibylla's parents. The dad saying like, well, you should try, if you're an atheist, you should be a priest for a little bit just to see what it's like, or something. Like, it's like, so there's like a parallel there. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, but it's kind of this thing where he's had, even though he's been successful, even though he is very smart, he's had decisions made for him instead of what he would like to have done.
Yes.
And Ludo suddenly showing up kind of feels to him like this opportunity to maybe have that, have like the mistakes he's made suddenly become like, maybe not justified, but like redeemed.
Yeah.
In this interesting way. And this is definitely the one where it's like when Ludo like reveals the lie, it kind of, you feel the worst for like the potential father, because it really does seem like it crushes him.
And then he punches him. He hits Ludo like twice in the head and then like falls on top of him. And so then he's like lying on top of him and then he just gets up and he's like normal again. Like nothing happened. Yeah.
And Ludo's like, so will you still get me into that school? And he's like, yeah, tell them I sent you. And then Ludo doesn't.
Yeah, because clearly not a good father. I also thought that there was a sort of version of the argument DeWitt was making, in that Sarabji is like trying to get people to do math that they think is difficult. And he says something like, you're going to have to get money from people that don't care what you do and don't want to be reminded that you do it, which I think is like a kind of like, I don't know, that's sort of I think a more, if not cynical, a more realistic idea on like public educators are really important, but also like they get, a scientist gets money from people who don't necessarily want to be like told the particulars of what they do. And they have to be sold like an image on it. And I think that's kind of related to the argument DeWitt's making about languages, but I thought it was an interesting like reflection of that. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I think that, again, Sarabji is like the public intellectual. Yeah. And that is like, there's kind of this way in which each of these fathers like is kind of a stand-in for like a different way of approaching like knowledge or learning or, creativity. And, each time like Ludo, despite having like all these tools, like in his tool belt in terms of all these languages and things, he keeps finding himself let down by the fact that all these supposedly like learned men do not seem like happy or satisfied with life. They're clearly like deeply like miserable and like have all these secrets, and they're all in some way deficient, and he's trying to like work through that as he tries to find like the ideal father. Which brings us to the third father, and probably one of the most disturbing parts of the book, which is the artist. And I also this one was the most confusing to me, I think, because the art that he's presented as doing is almost like a satire of modern art, but then he's kind of revealed to be like a monster. So he's like this kind of like weird modernist painter who says stuff like, I can't paint with blue. How can I paint with something I don't understand? And then his artworks involve like covering himself in paint and then like laying on canvas and stuff, I think. Or blood.
And so Ludo tracks this guy down, and he immediately tries to, he tells the lie, and the guy's like, no. He immediately calls his bluff and is like, there's no way you're my son. I feel like the implication is either this man is gay or like is such like a psycho that he's never had sex before.
He's just that obsessed with color. Or something.
And like, crucially, like, again, this one's like a little scary because Ludo like finds him in like an abandoned warehouse.
And then he tries to leave and the guy chases him down the hallway too.
He's like, I'll take you to Atlantis. And then like takes him like to a department store or something and like buys a knife and then like cuts Ludo's thumb and like uses it to make like weird art that like Ludo passes out and like wakes up with like this weird like thumbprint blood heart art next to him that this guy's just left.
Like some like weird like pact kind of that they made, and it's like, I don't think they talk about giving money, but the implication is that he could sell that for money because it's by this artist.
This artist is apparently like such a big deal that his paintings have sold for like $500,000.
So like, he wakes up with the thing and he's just like, it's kind of dangerous looking for a father. And then like the episode just kind of like ends. And so like, I don't really know what to do with this one other than like, maybe this guy is like, one, not well adjusted, and two, like the paintings seem to be like a satirical point about modern art in a way that like I find kind of, I don't know, unsatisfying, I guess. I don't know.
This one is a little bit weird because I'm a little Sibella clearly like has like a lot of like love of art, but like Ludo doesn't seem to be an artist, so I don't totally get where his attraction to this figure comes from at first.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's this idea of like the artist is somebody who has like very like heterodox ideas about knowing things, like the fact that he's like, I can't know about blue, so I'm gonna go buy a bunch of lamb's blood so I can learn about red.
Yeah.
You know, I can see that as kind of, again, like Ludo's trying to figure out what to do with his own knowledge. And so maybe it's this idea of like, well, this guy's like taken really interesting routes in terms of like what knowing things means. And he's like had all this material success from it. Maybe that's like what I'm supposed to be doing, or maybe that's like a good use of knowledge.
And when you spell it out that way, John, that makes me think that like, this is like sacrificing things in order to know things, and the idea that one, yeah, he got all this lamb's blood to make this, and also like, yeah, maybe he sacrificed parts of his social life in order to like think about color all the time. That like maybe that's like sort of related there.
Yeah, like I genuinely found this bit kind of upsetting because, again, like the thing with like him cutting his thumb, like it almost feels like it's a stand-in for something like a lot worse happening to Ludo.
Right.
From the standpoint of like, again, like he's just going up and like talking to strange men as like a small boy.
There's that part where like it's like the room was gray, his face was gray or something. Like, yeah. It's like,
you know, I mean, it's almost like a little bit of like a horror movie, like in the middle of this book. Like, obviously, everything turns out fine, but I genuinely like found this like pretty upsetting, and I'd almost kind of like to see Helen DeWitt do something like more horror inflected in the future, because I think she'd be really good at it.
Right, because like it's just so weird and unexpected, and there's a lot that's hinted at without it being explained too. So yeah.
I think the idea too is like kind of like he's seen these like two very conventional figures, like the like the old career academic, and then like the Neil deGrasse Tyson-y like TV scientist. Yeah. And now he's like, okay, I didn't like those guys. I'm gonna go find a weirdo. Maybe that's what's missing here.
Right, and then he's like, actually, this is dangerous, and I don't like what happened, so I'm just going to try to find somebody else. So.
Yes. Which brings us to the fourth samurai, the five-tool player.
Yeah, definitely the coolest guy. So,
yes, the ambassador. I don't know if I can actually pronounce his name.
Yeah, I don't know if I can either. Yeah, five-tool player, gambler, diplomat, womanizer, great breakfast guy, and he's funny. So yeah, five tool player.
So I think his name is Szigeti.
Okay, Szigeti.
Szegeti for those listening at home. Yeah, so once again he talks himself into this guy's like mansion, and Szigeti is interesting because he's the one, like the artist also didn't have a family that we knew of, but Szigeti's like kind of more of like a confirmed bachelor type.
Yeah.
And Ludo's like, I'm your son. And he's like, oh man, another one.
and he's like, has this happened before? And he's like, it's happened a lot. Like, yeah.
He says he lost track after the third time it happened.
Well, and I like that he does like a kind of King Solomon-esque thing where he's like, it's like every time somebody does this, the child is usually ugly. And isn't the implication that like he will take the child, and usually the mother is like, oh, never mind, or something like that?
Yeah, he basically like, as a way to kind of like weed out these without like an ugly court battle, he says like, oh yeah, this is my child. I will take him. He will never want for anything, but you never get to see him again.
Yeah.
And usually these women who are trying to like, I mean, I don't know for sure if this is true or not, but, you know, he thinks they're trying to con him, generally retract their offer at that point. But he's kind of an odd character. And then again, I find myself a little unsure of what he's supposed to kind of represent for Ludo. He is someone who's, again, been very, very like materially successful. He kind of tells a story about like how he ended up in diplomacy kind of through this very kind of madcap adventure in Belize.
Where he like wins a chest of passports. Yeah, in like an all
yeah,
night
and like
game.
helps like refugees like out of the country with them.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of this thing where like he's like had like a very adventurous life. He's helped a lot of people and been like very well rewarded for that fact. But I don't quite know like what this episode represents in the narrative.
So I noticed that in this one it's more contrasted with the sort of material plight of Sibylla and Ludo, where she's not making enough money, she has to sit at her computer all day, and she doesn't even have enough time to, you know, learn to mill. And so like it's contrasted with like this gambler who seemingly like is able to risk it all and win it back in like a really casual way. So it's almost like the material success father plus the idea of living a more romantic life than they're currently living, in whatever form that might take.
Yeah. And crucially, there is an interesting kind of twist in this episode where, again, I feel like it's a little ambiguous in terms of like whether or not this is true, but Szigeti basically tells they get to a point where like basically he went to Oxford at the same time that Sibylla was at Oxford, and he has a memory of seeing The Last Samurai with a girl who like made him like basically leave her house before they could sleep with each other, and he felt very slighted by this fact.
Yeah, and like it's like
held a grudge against the film The Last Samurai for like 15 years because of this fact.
When he's like, yeah, my date was just way more into the movie than I was. I was supposed to like be at a bridge date playing bridge with my partner, and instead I'm with this girl watching this movie I don't like, and she's not even into me. This reminded me, John, there was one time I went to a screening and the person opened by telling a story about how they went on a horrible date and they were the best thing about the date, which included seeing Seven Samurai! Exclamation point. So I think some people just don't like this movie for whatever reason, even though it's one of the masterpieces of modern cinema. And like, I think he's like slighted. He was like, why did I even go on this date? And my date was just way too into the movie than I was, basically.
Yeah. And like Ludo tries to like needle him a little bit, to be like, he's trying to figure out like, was this actually my mom? Like, was this like a missed memory? And he's like, he says like, I think her name was Rachel. And he's like, are you sure? And he's like, not really. Was she beautiful? Was she pretty? Is your mom pretty? And he's like, no, but she's beautiful.
Yeah, and he says something like, he's like, women have a lot of different kinds of emotions and they change their minds a lot, which makes them so great and like exasperating or something. It's like what he says. Like,
yeah. And then, yeah, basically this serves as kind of a springboard for Ludo to go back to his mother. And she also kind of seems to remember doing something similar like this, but she also doesn't remember if it was this guy or just some other guy like that. But it is kind of an interesting little, again, it's this thing that feels like it's frustrating you in terms of like, this feels like a thing where in a hackier version of this book, like he would like parent trap them back together.
Yeah.
And like all of a sudden, like, oh, they'd have all this money and could, you know, Sibylla would get her like happily ever after. Right. And I like that DeWitt does not do that.
Well, and they also kind of suggest that because he's like, he teaches him how to play like a gambling game. And he's like, you know, see me when you're older. We'll go to like the gambling spot in France, which I don't remember the name. And he's just
this is definitely the guy who feels like it almost feels like if Ludo wanted to make this guy his dad, like this guy would be up for it.
Yeah.
Because he clearly like he likes Ludo. He thinks he's really smart. He is, again, like he doesn't have another family to worry about. He does seem like he did like his mom when they knew when and if they did know each other. So he would probably be up for knowing her again.
Yeah.
But yeah, Ludo, again, I feel like this is the point in the book where Ludo kind of realizes that maybe there's something else going on rather than him wanting a dad. Because he kind of does get this opportunity to maybe actually get what he wants, but maybe he kind of is realizing that it's not really what he wants. And I think that it's like you said, because what we realize next is that he goes and he talks with his mother.
Yeah.
And gets a better idea of like her life and why she's made the decision she has.
Well, technically, I mean, he does talk to his mother, but he goes to Red Devlin, and then he crosses swords with his mother. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
So my bad. So we do have. Okay, let me step back a little bit. So this does feel important because it does feel like Ludo kind of almost getting what he wants and maybe kind of starting to realize it's not what he wants. And Red Devlin is kind of the summation of that fact. So Red Devlin is, I think, pretty crucial because he's the only one of the fathers who we hear anything about before Ludo like hears about him to go meet him.
Yeah.
So Red Devlin is like a adventure journalist, like war correspondent.
He's always going into like places and risking his life basically to like deliver like the truth about them.
Yes. And Ludo like is a like younger child, like loved adventure stories, like Call of the Wild, stuff like that. So, he's like read stuff by this guy. He's like referenced in the first part of the book. We're more in Sabella's shoes. And Ludo more or less like actually feels like maybe there is like a little bit more of a connection with this guy. He does like more of like a stakeout on this guy. He like learns more about his life. He like follows him to his house and like sees his family. Yeah. And then he like follows him one day and he finds out more or less that Red Devlin is planning on committing suicide.
Yeah. So he ends up basically spending time with Red Devlin as he's about to do suicide. And then like another major theme of the book, I think, peaks here, which is the idea of like, you should be able to commit suicide if you want to. Like, and the idea that like maybe if you're more aware of this is the one theme of the book that I have the most trouble with. Like maybe if you're more aware of some things than most people, it might seem like a more we might say achievable end. Which like, so apparently like Helen DeWitt also tried to commit suicide at one point, and she tried to do it with a bunch of aspirin. Much like close or about the same, like maybe and I think, hold on, I think Sabella's character does that, but Devlin does something else. But anyway, like the idea that like you could do that if you wanted to, and that boredom is a fate worse than death. And that like that should be like, you should be able to do it if you're bored enough, which like, I don't know what I think about this one, because it reminds me a little too much of some of David Foster Wallace's stuff, where he ends up saying something like, if you're really smart, you're going to get depressed a lot. And that feels like a little like too much like exceptionalism to me, in a way that I don't particularly like. So I don't know what I think about this theme. I think this scene is definitely good, like in terms of the book, in that like Ludo really tries to prevent this guy from killing himself. Eventually he does, and it really affects Ludo. And you get a lot of like sort of emotional intensity here, which is good. But in terms of the theme of the book, I'm not sure how I feel about that, I guess.
Yeah, again, this one, it's less scary. This is definitely like the one where it's the least funny in a way.
Yeah.
Just given kind of obviously. But yeah, I agree with you. I didn't really know what to make of the suicide stuff either, because I agree like with your read where like it smacks of exceptionalism a little too much, and it does kind of feel like there's this thing where she's kind of drawing this, I think, pretty fraught comparison to being like an intellectual, to being someone who's like seen human carnage on like an unimaginable scale.
Yeah, and like kidnapped and tortured too. Like, yeah.
Like Red Devlin's been through it in a way. Like, even if there's definitely kind of an implication where it's like, well, he didn't have to do this. Like he kind of like had something tweaked wrong in his brain where he ever wanted to do this to begin with.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like I don't think that like being a frustrated intellectual is the same as having been kidnapped and tortured,
or like having to work a bad job. I don't know. Yeah, like it's
I get maybe the point she's trying to make about like sensitivity. Like I did kind of find the bit about like calling into a crisis hotline.
Yeah,
and finding the fact that the people you're like who are supposed to be like talking you out of committing suicide are basically just reading off a script, and like don't they like are not in a place to actually be able to connect with you or like understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And it's this thing where it feels very like perfunctory. And the ways in which sometimes when you're in like that crisis state, it doesn't help. It makes you feel worse.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's something there, but I just don't know that it really, like, it almost feels like that is like a question that deserves a whole novel and not to be like the second to last like plot beat in a book like this.
And to be hinted at in the backstory of Sybilla's character without, giving a full sort of treatment of.
Yeah. It doesn't not work, but I feel like it feels a little bit like the conversation we had about the Brutalist, where it just ends up like a little bit too all over the place to say something quite satisfying.
Yeah. And like, again, it's like, I get the idea of being sensitive to stuff, but I am resistant to link like depression with intelligence. Like, it just seems like a little too like you're a little too a special boy who sees too much, I guess, or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
Well, it's especially strange because I feel like so much of what the book is otherwise saying is that, again, like, art and knowledge and learning can be like a huge bulwark against like despair. I feel like that's the overall message of the book, and this kind of thing where it's like, yeah, but also you won't be a normie anymore, and you won't be able to ignore how fucked up the world is, because people won't understand when you're referencing Oscar Wilde.
2 thumbs down to that. Yeah.
I mean, it just feels very, and again, maybe there's a read that I'm missing here, and I'm more than willing to be like corrected on this if I'm missing something. But again, when this book feels overall like, so for lack of a better term, like democratic about what it's saying about the possibilities of like the human mind and like, yeah, our ability to like learn and define meaning and knowledge, like existential meaning and knowledge, it feels very weird to also take the tack of like, yeah, but sometimes you read too many books and then you get real sad.
Yeah, that's like that's all Infinite Jest is. And while I like some of the writing, I grew to be extremely suspect of that point of view, like as I aged upward. So yeah,
like if I'm gonna steel man it, I think maybe what it's trying to say is like, well, there is sorrow because most people never find themselves in the position to like. It's not that they are incapable of this stuff or there's something fundamentally deficient about them. They just have never been in the position to learn in this way or to have this like deeper like relationship with, you know, these things that is so important to some people and, you know, that they are capable of. And so it kind of feels like you're dealing with maybe again, it's this feeling of you're dealing with people who have been denied something and that makes you sad, but even then that still smacks a little bit too much of like, well, I'm glad I'm a special goody good boy who did get to experience these things and I'm not like one of these half people.
Okay, John, so it's a photo of a Latin grammar book and Nebraskan fried chicken, and the caption says, "Never kill yourself." But yeah, I agree, John, that I don't like the special goody good boy stuff. And I think to your pro reading, I think like she has Devlin say like the open sesame thing, which is like, yeah, the idea like you're trying to get other people to see what you see and they just can't. And so then now you're cursed. Like,
which I don't think is like, again, I can see that with the stuff about like art and the humanities, because I think we have all had this experience of it's like, you've been deeply affected by like a piece of art and the people around you are just like, I was bored the whole time. And you're trying to like explain to them like why this was actually transcendently good. And they're just like, I was just looking at my phone. And like, that is frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like that being contrasted, or like I don't like a parallel being drawn between that and like getting kidnapped and tortured by like a terrorist militia for doing like war correspondence.
Right. Like that's two different orders of magnitude. So
it's not the same thing. It's a metaphor that I just don't think fully holds up. But I still think that it works from the standpoint that Ludo like has this moment of like genuine connection with one of these men. And I think for the first time ends up kind of in a situation where he feels like he's let someone down, whether or not that's fair.
And that's a lot to put on yourself to try to talk somebody away from suicide, essentially.
Especially like a total stranger.
Right, yeah.
But it's sort of this thing where like he's not pulling back from someone who has like disappointed him. Like you kind of get the impression that he would like to be able to do more to help this other person.
Yeah.
But he's incapable of it because it's just not possible. And that really resonated with me.
Mm.
There was something very true to me in that, in terms of like being an 11-year-old or like a 12-year-old and feeling very smart and feeling like you should be able to help people who are like in distress. I never went through something quite like this, but I remember, being this age and being like, well, I'm really smart. I can help people with their problems.
Yeah.
And then finding, oh no, their problems are far deeper than I understand. And there's in fact nothing I can say or do here that is going to help. Yeah, that resonated with me in a way that maybe some of the suicide stuff didn't quite. But I think DeWitt is, again, like a really good author. And I think even like when she falls flat, like she managed to do it in a way where it still has a lot of interesting resonances. And clearly, like, we're still pulling a lot to talk about here from it. So can't be all bad.
And the emotional truth to me, like you were saying, I like that. It's just thematically, it's like the suicide theme is the one that's like less, I don't know, successful to me than the others maybe. But
well, it's kind of the moment like in this is kind of like the dark moment in a Wes Anderson movie kind of beat where it's like,
honestly,
we realize like, oh, like being precocious is not like a solution to all life's problems.
It's the needle in the hay. It's the needle in the hay montage. Yeah.
Maybe that's a little bit off base in some way. I don't know if Wes Anderson's quite the right comparison here, but that's what it's making me associate to right now.
Yeah.
Because it is this little turn where all of a sudden like things get very real in a book that has been kind of operating on a slightly more comic level. Yeah.
Well, and he takes Devlin's jacket too, which I think is significant as well. So
yeah, it's the first time he's taken anything from one of these men.
Well, and so then that's when he crosses swords with Sibylla right after that, when he's like actually pretty worked up about what happened. And he sort of is like demanding that Sibylla kind of explain what they're doing, and why they're doing it.
Yeah. I mean, do you have something to say on this section, Ben?
I felt like this one had it sort of like, it would have been interesting if the book ended here. Because it's almost like it's perfectly anticlimactic where like she can't really explain herself. She's been trying to work out what to do this whole time. And there's almost like a suggestion of like, this is all I can do. And I just have to get better at doing it. And like, either teaching you or like accepting where I am or like, I don't know. There's something kind of like unresolvedness about this that like in the next one, the final one, like is a little bit better, but it would have been interesting if the book ended here. Like she sort of can't really explain what's going on. And there's an implication that she's going to keep trying anyway.
Yeah. No, she says, I like the line where it's like, when you have a motel, you can always buy another one. Which is kind of we didn't really get into like her background, which the book starts with, but like her parents, her father, like wanted to go to Harvard, but like was forced to go to like seminary to satisfy his father, who was a minister, and then ended up like buying a motel in like the middle of nowhere in America. And,
Motel
her
land.
mother, wanted to be like a concert musician, but she didn't believe in herself enough to like go to her second Juilliard audition. And so she ended up just getting married. And like they kind of ended up having this very like life of quiet desperation. Put it in kind of classic parlance. And Sibylla like very deliberately made the choice to move to England and to go to Oxford, like is to kind of try to reject that, but then kind of ended up leading her own kind of life of quiet desperation. And it feels like this kind of person who, again, it's kind of this weird thing where you realize like, oh, I've, replicated a lot of these dynamics like I learned from my parents subconsciously.
The symptom, like you were saying. Yeah.
Yeah. She's like realized that she's like kind of a symptom of her parents. And she's trying to figure out if there's like a way to be a parent that isn't just going to like lead to Ludo like subconsciously reenacting her traumas and issues.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not a parent, so I don't even know if that's possible, but it seems like it's a big thing to try to do. And I do like it because I feel like this is the core relationship of the book. I mean, as much as time as we spend with Ludo kind of on his own in the second part of the book, like this is a book about a mother and a son.
Yeah.
And, a mother and a son without a father. And I think we also kind of realize the ways in which like Sibylla's kind of been trying to be both parents, and kind of her compulsive desire to like educate Ludo is kind of this way where she's trying to be sufficient for him as a single parent. And I think that it gets important when we get to the final samurai, the last samurai, who is actually kind of is Ludo's father, because she has been following advice that this guy gave for teaching children music to raise Ludo.
Yeah, yeah. I also like too that they go to one of his concerts, and like it's a big scene where like it's a really long concert. She's so taken by the music that Ludo gets bored and takes himself home, as well as she has to like work the entire evening to make up for all the time all the money that they spent to go to the concert. So it's like this big scene, and it's nice for that character to come back for the final father.
Yeah, yeah. So this scene, so that brings us to the last scene. And I found myself thinking a little bit like you did, Ben, where I was kind of like, well, what is the utility here of this last scene? It almost feels a bit like a dream in a way, where Ludo kind of feels a little bit more mature in this section. And he comes to this guy, and this guy like says like, I don't teach lessons. Ludo like tries to play the I'm your son card, but this guy is too young for it to be possible.
Yeah.
Because he's like a former child prodigy.
And he's always getting in trouble for not playing the hits, which is one of my favorite bits. But yeah.
But Sibylla like was reading about him to learn like, how do I deal with having like a prodigy son? And so it's kind of this way where he's almost more of a brother than a father, I guess.
Yeah.
But they have this, they connect, and the implication is kind of that for both of them, they both have had these tremendous opportunities to learn these things most people never get the chance to learn. And like you said, Ben, Yokohama is constantly like getting shit for not playing the hits and kind of doing the things that would make it easier for him to have like a more standard, like lucrative career in classical music, which I assume was easier to do in the 1990s than it is now. But he like has this, he wants to make a CD, which that was another thing that's a little funny, was they kept referring to an album as a CD.
We're going to make a CD. Yeah.
But he's like, no one's going to want to listen to this. The stuff I want to do like isn't what people want to hear. And Ludo basically says, but you still should do it.
And isn't he like, I want to hear it or something too? Like, isn't he kind of present himself?
Yeah, I think
as
there's
like,
an implication there. But to me, it was kind of this thing of it's like, well, you do it because you want to.
Yeah. Because
it's what your heart is drawn towards, not because you have these ulterior motives. Like that, there is existential value in like creating art and producing and taking in knowledge that transcends, kind of material concerns in a way.
Yeah.
Or at least that's the hope.
Yeah, only connect. I think it's just what they usually say about writing. Like, if you're connecting with somebody, and if it makes you happy, and maybe one person likes it, that's good. That's enough. Yeah.
And I mean, I think that when I finished this and kind of got through that last bit, I found myself thinking, a little bit about what we're doing here. I think that we both don't hold out any illusions like we're going to get millionaires off doing we're going to become millionaires off doing the show. We know that we're producing something that's pretty niche, and that's why we're always so grateful to you guys for listening. But we're in a really weird time where there's a lot of questioning of like what the utility of doing critical or creative work is, and a lot of people kind of want people to stop doing it, and you kind of do have to find reasons to do it that go beyond making money,
or like or careerist kind of vibes.
And I mean, and that's tricky in a way, but I don't know, I think a lot about the fact that a lot of people throughout history created without a financial incentive. I feel like there's kind of this thing where, again, we look back at like the kind of age of mass literacy where all of a sudden you had all these people like making a living writing books. And I think about maybe that was an aberration.
Yeah.
But despite that fact, like people have been writing books as long as they've been able to write, regardless of like a financial incentive. And I guess I take some comfort in that, as much as I would love to live in a world where people made a lot of money writing, or, God forbid, I could make money writing or doing a book podcast or whatever. I think there is kind of an element where you just kind of have to take solace in the fact like literature is not going to die, even if way fewer people read. Art's not going to die, even if the people like don't care about art in the way that maybe we do. These things, might have different like audiences, might be more for kind of a smaller group of people, but that, like you said, Ben, it's about connecting. Even if you have an audience of one, that's something. I don't know. It's not a comfortable answer all the time, but we live in a time where sometimes you have to find you have to make the best of it.
Yeah, and like I think too, if the idea is to get people to learn languages, as we were saying on the opening, I think this ending is sort of aligning with that, and that like if a couple people decided to learn, to read the Odyssey in ancient Greek, like that would be a success based on this book. And I think too that like I like the kind of collaboration that ends sort of, because as you said, he's more of a brother than a father, and it's kind of like they're working together, which I think is a nice vibe at the end, rather than just Ludo being like, thank God my father. It's like, well, we could do it together or something. Like there's like, if you do this, I'll do that. Like, and so there's sort of like a pact there that I like in terms of, so like widening the family unit, and maybe if Sibylla doesn't have the answers, then meeting new people is one way to do it. But I think, for the like the democratic idea, I think it makes sense. Like you should do it because you like to do it, and you should try, if at least one person is connecting, I think it's worth it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, I hate to get all like dramatic at the end here, but it's kind of one of these things where it's like, well, I mean, what else do we have? It's like you have to hope you can connect with people on this stuff, because what else is there? What?
Yeah.
Fuck, I don't know.
Well, John, as Ryan Ruby says, reading and writings are ethical acts. And if we would have, our servants live for us, we might as well just promptly blow our own brains out. So it's
true.
Yeah. So,
Well, Ben, anything else to say about the Last Samurai before we start wrapping up today?
I think I really liked this on a reread, and I think the idea seems more radical than it might have even felt when the book came out. Like, because again, it's like we could have computers do this, and so the idea that it's worth it to do it on your own for various reasons, I think, seems more radical today almost. And if the sort of datedness of the kind of precocious child thing, I think, as you said, I think it's a good deconstruction of it, and I think I wouldn't be put off by that. And I also, the last thing I'll say is I like that this book presents characters that are really into reading, and while that is kind of like a circular thing, it's one of the best examples I can think of it. So just the idea that a character would want to quote something, at you, so to speak, the reader, I like that. I mean, I wouldn't have it in every book, but I think it's important.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I found myself thinking at one point, man, I bet Sibylla would kill to live in a time with zlib.
Yeah, just downloading like PDFs at home.
Would have made raising Ludo a lot easier.
A PDF with which no desktop would be complete without.
Well, I've definitely said all I have to say on the topic. As someone who's been trying to teach myself some languages over the last couple of years, I will say it's a struggle, but it's one of the most rewarding things I've spent my time doing. So if you've been putting that off, maybe give this a read and then think about doing that some more, or just do it.
Yeah, or just do
things.
Yeah. There's no stopping you.
So, you just learn stuff.
Yeah.
It's easier than ever in some ways. You just got to not be on your phone. All right. Well, listeners, we will be back in 2 weeks with The Gentleman of the Road by Michael Chabon. Another very fun book. But until next time, I've been John.
I've been Ben.
I don't know why I said that. That's not usually how we sign off on this. Anyway, Semper Books.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir.